Alrighty, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Doffney, and I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. And it's my pleasure to present our speaker for today, Joseph Murray, who's going to be talking about what he considers the real stone election. And that's going to be Frank Hague and the 1937 race for governor. So we're really excited to have Joe here with us. He was born and raised in Jersey City and earned a dual major BA in English Literature and History from Jersey City State College, as well as an MA in European History from New York University, and a Master's Certificate in Contract Management from George Washington University. His article, Bosses and Reformers, The Jersey City Victory Movement of 1957, was published in New Jersey History in 1985, receiving that year's William A. Whitehead Award. Ongoing research into bossism and machine politics in Jersey City led to the production of the documentary miniseries covering New Jersey's boss, Frank Hague, the rise of the movement that unseated him, and the successor democratic machine of John V. Kennedy. So we're really excited, Joe, to have you here today.
Thank you.
And we're going to be steeped in political history for this NJ 250 presentation. So, we will be taking your questions at the end of the program today, but you can submit them at any time using the Q&A or the chat feature in the Zoom dashboard. At the end of the webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey. So if you have time, we ask that you please complete the survey. We really appreciate any and all feedback that you can give us. And if you want more information about what's going to be discussed here, Joe has published an article that's available at the web address on the screen there. I will send that address out in the chat momentarily once we get underway so that you can download that and read it at your leisure. That is everything that I have for you, so I'm going to turn it over to Joe now.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy that you could join us for this particular talk. This research actually comes from the article that Andrew mentioned. So I'm sharing with you essentially the findings that I arrived at with that research and giving you some contextual foundation as an introduction to how the election could deem to be stolen by a political machine that could reach that level of authority and that level of control of the electoral process. So we'll actually begin with somewhat of an introduction. In 1937, we had a gubernatorial race that involved Lester Clee as the Republican Party candidate, facing then U.S. Senator A. Harry Moore, who had previously served as governor twice. So ostensibly, it was a two-man race, a two-party contest, but it turned out to be much more. So Lester Clee, who was a clergyman and a reformer, he was part of a movement within the Republican Party called the Clean Government Movement, which we'll talk about in a moment. And he turned this race into a referendum on machine politics and bossism. He called it a great fight to protect democracy in the state of New Jersey. This was not a two-man contest. He turned it into a referendum on the democratic process within the state. And therefore, the whole target of his campaign was Frank Hague. So Hague became, although he was not a candidate, he was the mayor of Jersey City, but he became the sum and substance of the Clee platform. It was all about anti-bossism and saving democracy from machine politics. So, was it really a stolen election? Well, on the face of it, it sure looked like it could have been. It certainly appeared that way to the Republicans at the time and to pretty much everybody with an open mind who wasn't an adherent of the Hague machine. So the results showed a GOP sweep. All the down ballot races went to the Republicans. They gained control of the state assembly and the state senate. And this red mirage, which showed Clee on the evening of election night, being well ahead of his opponent by an 80,000 vote margin. However, that lead vanished overnight because the next day, once Hudson County's votes were tabulated, it showed a massive amount of votes for a Harry Moore, which put Moore over the top and gave him a 45,000 vote plurality. Now, when you look at Jersey City's vote alone, which is where the Hague machine was anchored in Jersey City, immediately you run into some statistical and mathematical challenges because there were more votes than there were registered voters. So assuming the best conditions for voter turnout, of all the registered voters, if 90% of them actually went to the polls and voted, you would have gotten about 120,000 votes. Instead, there were 145,000. So there's approximately 20,000 plus votes unaccounted for and unexplained. And every attempt to try and figure that out, every investigation, as we'll see, that was pursued, was thwarted, was blocked, was derailed, evidence was suppressed and withheld, and any legal challenges undertaken by Clee and his associates were, as we shall see, obstructed in the extreme. Now, this is a picture of A. Harry Moore and Frank Hague. A. Harry Moore was a creation, a political creation of Frank Hague, and they were together their entire careers, and Hague was the force behind his every political move and every political action. Now, one historian, Alfred Steinberg, referred to this particular election as the biggest swindle of Hague's career, the best example of a stolen election or of a fraudulent vote due to institutionalized voter fraud in Hudson County. The thing that jumps out at us here is that the party that lost is tacitly complicit in the fraud, as we shall see, meaning that the Republicans actually enabled the Hague machine to sway the election from their own candidate. The reprisal of events reveals what I consider to be the Orwellian character of Hague's machine and the police state tactics that it used, particularly at election time, to distort and interfere with and disrupt the election process, intimidate election officials, sometimes through the use of physical force, many of the election officials being nominally Republican, as we shall see, conceal voting registration or voting record evidence that is central to the story here, and short-circuiting or obstructing any post-election forensics. Any election investigation that was prosecuted by the opposing party to try and understand how they lost was virtually dead-ended. So that's just a quote from one of the election officials whom we'll visit with in a minute, who basically said it was a stolen election. Trivia question we can skip. So machine politics is at the center of this story. What is it? It's personalized community politics that thrives on favors and services in exchange for votes. Patronage is at the center of this. It's called machine, as we'll see in a minute, because it produces replicatable election results through voter manipulation, oftentimes with blatant features of corruption and fraud. And a machine operation fuses government with party apparatus to the extent that official positions are totally monopolized within an exclusive one-party system, and in the case of Hudson County, almost like a one-party state. And there's a linkage with Tammany Hall, which was the famous Democratic machine in New York, dominated by the Irish, where politics is a business. And you'll see this also in Hague's statements, where he just sees politics and business as being synonymous. So if you're in politics, it's the business of your life, according to the Tammany Hall sage, George Washington Plunkett. So the machine metaphor, why we use the term machine to describe this form of politics, is basically it operates so systematically and with an order and discipline and efficiency that it's all about well-engineered electoral outcomes. It's perpetuating power through manipulation of the election and democratic processes. So they methodically manage the election process, which is exactly what Hague did and what his machine masterminded in Hudson County. Use manipulation, intimidation, and fraud to achieve the desired electoral outcomes. And in order to achieve those two objectives, manufacture the votes and manufacture the voters necessary to win. So basically, it puts party over the rule of law and over the democratic process. In this case, the Democratic Party. Although there were political machines in New Jersey that were Republican. That was one of the trivia questions earlier on about the Republican machine in Atlantic County, headed up by a guy named Nucky Johnson, who collaborated with Hague to advance their mutual interests. At the top of the machine, there's usually a boss, sometimes an office-holding boss, as was the case with Frank Hague. He was mayor of Jersey City for 30 years, and he never really pursued any other position because that was his cockpit of power. He ran the show. He made party and policy and personnel decisions, in many cases single-handedly. He decided who became the candidates, who would run and win office in order to do the bidding of the machine and basically turn the government over to the political operation under the boss's command. Key to this was the dispensation of patronage, how patronage was the rewards basically for participating in the machine ethos. Very little regard for competency, law, public interest. It was all about perpetuating the machine and doing the bidding of the boss to the benefit of those who were in power. Public interest, think of the Roman Empire analogy of bread and circuses. Keep the public entertained, so they had lavish entertainments during the campaign season that became, in effect, consume the public with the spectacle of politics and keep their eye off of what you do once you're in office. So they amassed power, political power, and economic power, as we'll see in the case of Hague, because of his influence over the port economy of Jersey City. They rewarded loyalty, they suppressed dissent, sometimes violently, but oftentimes cruelly and effectively to the advantage of the machine interests at stake. Funded party functions and enriched themselves along the way. So the machine operated at a local level, but as Hague exemplifies, exerted influence both on the state and national political stage. So as we saw with George Washington Plunkett and the Tammany Hall quotation about politics being a business, Hague himself referred to it as such quite often. That if you don't understand the business of politics, you shouldn't be in it. And if you are in it, you're in it because it's a business you're going to pursue for life. Underpinning that is this notion of honest graft, meaning that, okay, we're running the government, therefore we are entitled to opportunities to self-enrich. How did they do that? They monetized public works projects. They made money from real estate speculation. In Jersey City's case, Journal Square, the Holland Tunnel, the Pulaski Skyway, every major undertaking that was supported by or pursued by the city or the county had collateral remuneration benefits for those who were in office and who were part of the machine enterprise. Now that's even before the New Deal patronage bonanza that came on, that became a part of the Hague culture once FDR became president in 1932. So in the midst of the Depression, that's when the Hague machine capitalized most on political patronage from Washington. And as a result, my contention is you're dealing with much more than a typical urban political machine. You're looking at a political syndicate here that encompassed both political parties. Yes, it was a Democratic machine. Yes, nominally the Democrats were in the minority in New Jersey at that time, but they ran the state. Notwithstanding the fact, as we'll see, that you had the legislature in the hands of, and the governors, in this particular case, the governor was also a Republican, didn't matter. The political syndicate of Hague's machine ran the state. So fueling that was this separatist ethos of Hudson County. It was the most densely populated, urban and industrialized and immigrant county in the state, predominantly Irish, but very strongly Italian, and that ethnic mix changed over the period of time that we're going to be looking at. And it was very much an antipathy towards the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites that were in Trenton throughout the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century. It became an us against them tribal mentality, and that animated the politics and the behavior of the politicians. So Jersey City, by virtue of its part of the New York port and the New York harbor, in some ways it was the sixth borough of New York, and that gave it kind of an outsider status within New Jersey that allowed Hague to take advantage of that and make it almost a state within a state, a province within New Jersey that operated by its own rules and its own law. One-party rule in Hudson County, as we shall see, extended to Trenton, and this election epitomizes how that actually worked. I'm going to quickly go through this. I mentioned the position of Jersey City in the New York Harbor. That's Jersey City on the left. There's Manhattan. New York Harbor at that time was the world's busiest port, and it was a bifurcated harbor. It was split between two states, and Jersey City and to some degree Hoboken and Weehawken occupied the New Jersey side, the left bank of New York Harbor, and gave the port economy it made the port economy a huge part of New Jersey politics. And Hague took full advantage of that, both politically and economically. So it was bifurcated in the sense that you had marine terminals in New York City. Next slide, you can click, please. So you had ships and piers that landed in Manhattan, but all the railroads, all the trunk railways terminated in New Jersey. Everything that shipped across the United States came to Jersey City or Hoboken and then had to be offloaded and transported to the ships that docked in Manhattan. That system was called lighterage. We won't get too much into it, but it's a big part of the research I've been recently doing for an article about the waterfront itself and how that plays into the political machine. So all the freight yards and all the cargo was in Jersey City. You could almost view it as being held hostage in Jersey City in order to get to its termination point in New York, where it would go on to delivery either overseas or to Manhattan and the other boroughs of New York City. So the main sources of revenue in the harbor economy, from railroaders, from shippers, stevedores, who were the movers of the cargo at the port and at the piers, truckers, because trucking was only just coming into play. Holland Tunnel had just opened up in 1927. Lighterage was the main form of transportation and transmodal movement of goods from the rail yards of Jersey City to the ships in Manhattan. The loading rackets are bolded there because that became a huge income opportunity for Hague and his machine operatives. And the unions had no power of their own. They were basically run by the stevedores and controlled. They had no independent power, even though there were labor unions. They were subservient to the stevedores, to the railroads in some cases, but they were definitely under the heel of the political bosses, both at Tammany Hall and in Frank Hague's orbit in Hudson County. Kickbacks and shakedowns offered a take that is beyond estimate. That's a quote that came from the New York Crime Commission investigation into waterfront crime in the 1950s. And it was even more so back in the 30s and 40s. So Hague had a partnership with a guy named Bill McCormick, who was considered the Mr. Big, a very kind of undercover guy. Not many people knew about him until much later. But these two guys had their Jersey City connection from their childhood, and it continued throughout Hague's reign as boss of Hudson County. They were in business together. They ran what you could easily call a waterfront ecosystem on the New Jersey side. McCormick was based in New York, so he had interests on both sides of the Hudson, and ran the stevedoring and operations throughout the port of New York. And he and Hague were joined at the hip, which is why I refer to them as bosses of the port economy. So one author, Stephen Hart, refers to the waterfront in Hudson County as an outlaw frontier. Why? Because it was a massive underworld economy that thrived on racketeering and smuggling, robbing the cargo, in plain sight, skimming wages from the union workers, the ILA workers, many of whom were ex-cons and were desperate for work, extortion, kickbacks. There were gambling operations on the waterfront, loan sharking, you name it. That's what happened in the waterfront underworld economy. And the machine profited from every one of these activities. Which leads to the conclusion that Hague had economic power coupled with political power, which made him a national figure. So here we see him. This is on the eve of the 1931 Democratic Convention that ultimately wound up nominating FDR. There's Hague with New York Mayor Jimmy Walker and Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, who preceded a guy named Ed Kelly, who became a very, very close friend and ally of Frank Hague's on the national level in how the Democratic Party operated, particularly at the conventions. Now, the gentleman on the far right of this photograph, the mayor of Chicago, literally took a bullet for FDR. FDR's first visit, I think it was in Georgia, it was in the South. He decided to go with him, and an assassin shot at FDR, and it hit Cermak, which protected FDR, and then Cermak died a few weeks later. And that allowed Ed Kelly to become mayor of Chicago, which we will see the consequences of shortly. Now, one of the things that becomes very apparent to me in the research that I'm doing now is the pronounced connection between Hague and Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall and its political operation was the blueprint for the Hague machine, except Hague took it farther. He developed it and refined it and perfected it in ways that New York couldn't. Al Smith, who ran for president against FDR in 1932, was Hague's friend and mentor. Here he's pictured at Deal, New Jersey, which is where Hague had his summer mansion. And that's Al Smith on the far right and his son on the left, Hague in the middle looking rather dapper. They were obviously guests at Hague's home at the Jersey Shore. It was Al Smith who appointed Hague to the Democratic National Committee in 1922, where Hague remained as vice chairman up until 1950, when his power was waning. He was Smith's floor manager at both conventions and advocated and fought furiously for Smith to be nominated. Smith was both Irish and Catholic, as was Frank Hague. Bill McCormick, the guy we saw in the previous slide, who was the waterfront Mr. Big, he was a close friend and ally of Al Smith. In fact, he helped Smith get a job when Smith lost re-election as governor in New York and put him in the business. So they had business links, they had political links, and they were all part of a very, very tightly run political elite, Irish Catholic political elite, crossing the river between New York and New Jersey. Tammany Hall and the Hague machine linked at the hip. Next. There's Hague earlier on, just appointed to the Democratic National Committee. This gave him national influence, and he used it fully and fulsomely. Now, FDR didn't particularly like Hague. He found him vulgar and crude, but he needed Hague, and he supported Hague right up until the end, and Hague supported him. Now, what Hague did do in 32 was he supported Al Smith at the convention. Smith lost to FDR. Hague immediately went and spoke to the gentleman in the middle, whose name is Fawley. He was FDR's campaign guy and his consigliere, if you will. Hague said, we're going to mend fences, and I'm going to give FDR the biggest rally he's ever had if he opens up the 1932 campaign in New Jersey, which FDR did, and it was indeed the biggest political rally ever held up until that point in time, anywhere in the U.S. That was in Seagirt, down the shore, where great things happen. So, in the campaign for re-election, FDR's re-election in 1936, he came to Jersey City, and Hague whipped up the crowd, brought out 250,000 people. There's no film footage that I was able to find. There are a lot of photographs. It is astonishing, the kind of reception that FDR got when he came to Jersey City. And what he did do when he was there was he laid the cornerstone for the Jersey City Medical Center, which was one of Hague's personal pet projects, funded entirely by New Deal funds from the WPA and CWA, WPA in this case, right? So the symbiotic relationship gave FDR a landslide victory in New Jersey, right? And it made Hague, from that point on, indispensable to FDR. FDR couldn't win national election without New Jersey, and he couldn't win New Jersey without Hague. So whether he liked him or not, he was a necessary political ally. And Hague was rewarded in return. New Jersey received over $400 million from the WPA alone during that period. Hague secured 67+ million for Jersey City between 32 and 1940. And a lot of jobs came as a result of that, not to mention some of the bosses' monuments, such as the Roosevelt Stadium and the medical center in particular. The Jersey City Armory was another one. So Hague benefited enormously from this relationship, and he did, in fact, contribute greatly to the development of Jersey City with the funds that he received. However, he had complete control of how elections were run and managed. That's the whole notion of machine politics. Astonishing efficiency to produce the election outcomes that were desired. We already saw in the 37 election, which we'll get to in a moment, the disproportionate amount of voters in Jersey City, and the registered voters turning out to the tune of 95+%. It always exceeded expectations, and in most cases exceeded mathematical logic, because the voter registration rolls were completely inflated, and there were no voting machines used in Hudson County elections until they were imposed by the state in 1944. And coincidentally, Hague's political clout and influence started to wane from that period onward. He wasn't able to win statewide elections from 44 on. But in 1937, there were 160,000 plus registered voters in Jersey City, but there are only 147,000 eligible adults to be registered. So there again, you have that discrepancy, that gap of about 20,000 registered voters that always came at the last minute to support the candidate that Hague was putting forward. How did he do this? Well, it couldn't have been done without paper ballots. They're highly susceptible to fraud. It's all about signature matching and getting the concurrence of the people manning the polls, the election officials who actually supervise the process, and how a ballot was issued after a match was determined by the polling station election official, many of whom were encouraged to go the way the machine wanted them to go. This led to this popular belief that when you die, this is a quote from Brendan Byrne, who was governor when I was in college and graduate school. He said, "When I die, I want to be buried in Hudson County because I want to remain politically active." That was all about the whole idea that Hague basically could summon the dead to vote. And it was not a far-fetched, this particular caricature is not a far-fetched metaphor, because Hague in most cases did rely on the registration, the active registration of voters who were no longer either in the area or no longer alive. So now we'll get to the meat of the matter. The precursor to the gubernatorial election of 37, that again shows how Hague completely controlled the electoral process. In his re-election, this was his re-election to the office of mayor. Actually, it was a commission system. So he was re-elected commissioner. And the way he was able to do that in a runaway fashion in 1937 was simply emasculating, if not neutering, the Republican Party in Hudson County. He basically ran unopposed. So the Republican opposition was hopelessly ineffectual by design, because the Republicans in Hudson County were essentially operatives of the Hague machine. And this gentleman, Charles F. Stobling, who we will be visiting quite a lot over the next remaining time to our discussion, was the county party leader for the Republicans in Hudson. And he was also an election official who was instrumental in preventing any discovery of fraud by the Republicans who challenged the outcome of the election. So the precursor here that kind of warms us up to the idea that, hey, Hague virtually walked into re-election with a staggering unanimous vote. He actually refers to it in a speech, which we're going to hear if we can play. He says he was elected unanimously, and in fact, he engineered the votes so that it would be almost a unanimous election. Can you play that for us?
I've been elected to office for over 25 years at the head of the government of your city. The last time I was elected was only but a few months ago, and it was very near unanimously. And when you realize, my friends, that thousands, practically 90% of the inhabitants of Jersey City are working people, that shows you that my record speaks for itself.
In his political heyday, Hague ruled his city so absolutely that it was a matter of indisputable fact rather than boasting when he declared, "I am the law." He was a force in national politics, too, for at Democratic conventions, his iron control of the New Jersey vote made him a decisive figure in many close contests.
So it's not my opinion alone. It was nationally recognized that Hague was probably a paragon of machine politics and boss rule. So that's why I refer to him at this period of time as his reign was bossism on steroids. And he acted accordingly. He had no compunction about doing what he did, and he made no apologies for it. It was brazen politics, raw and extreme in many ways. So when it came time to have a gubernatorial election, Hague simply magnified the techniques that were used to engineer his return to office as mayor and pulled out all the stops to make sure that A. Harry Moore defeated Lester Clee in a very important election for the office of governor. Now, what you notice in this picture is that's A. Harry Moore on the left. He's voting with his wife, and he's voting manually, paper ballots, signing the registry, comparing signatures, getting a ballot, and casting it, as we saw earlier. Conversely, Lester Clee voting in Newark is using a mechanical voting machine, which were predominantly used throughout the state, with the exception of Hudson County. So, of course, Moore was vilified for being a Hague puppet. Now, if any of you remember Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, that's what this cartoon implies, that essentially Moore was Hague's puppet, and he was referred to as Hague's puppet, particularly by this gentleman, who happens to be my grandfather. Now, he appears as a candidate in this contest, as a third-party candidate. He was a schismatic Democrat who ran, I always thought, until I did this research, I always thought he ran in the primary. He skipped the primary and ran as an anti-Hague independent Democrat. The reason why he's useful and important to understand this election is because of what Hague did to him in terms of the votes that were cast for him as a third-party candidate. So he wanted to be the spoiler candidate that deflected votes away from A. Harry Moore in Hudson County that would obviously advantage the Republican nominee, the Republican contender, Clee. So in effect, he was acting on behalf of the Republicans. So he actually, as a Democrat, was so concerned with the perpetuation of Hague's power that he was willing to support Republicans instead of the Democratic candidate of his own party. So as we saw in the intro, overnight, magically, Hudson County produced the decisive plurality that put Moore over the top. And this astonished everybody because they thought it would be a very, very close race, especially the Republicans. So if we drill down into the numbers, and I don't want to dwell on it too much, but you can see why looking at Murray's votes and what he should have gotten versus what he got, explains the machinations used to tilt the election. So real quickly, Moore carried only 6 of the state's 21 counties. Very, very thin pluralities, less than 2,000 votes in most cases, where that was the best showing he could produce. The strongest showings were in Hudson and Middlesex counties, which were Hague-dominated strongholds. Now, if you compare this to the preceding gubernatorial election 3 years earlier, there's a vast difference because the Democratic candidate only got about 90,000, but this time Moore got almost 130. Now, various theories about this, but Hague actually preferred to work with the Republican opponent rather than William Dill, who was a Democratic reformer. So there was widely held suspicion that he actually preferred Hoffman to win, and Hoffman did indeed win. Now let's go to James F. Murray. Barely 400 votes from his native hometown. 5 years before, in the commission election, he won almost 30,000 votes in his second run for city commissioner. And then in 49, when he actually defeated the Hague candidates, he won with almost 74,000 votes. So it stretches the imagination almost implausibly to think that he could only muster 400 votes. He himself expected and proved in his own way that he should have gotten about 15 to 20,000 votes. He won more votes in a Republican-dominated county, Mercer County, than he did in his own Hudson County Democratic stronghold. So clearly there was foul play. There was manhandling of the ballots. The conventional wisdom of the time was that they were destroyed. The ballots were simply destroyed. So in addition to creating new voters, to create that 20,000 vote difference, in the case of Murray, they didn't bother. They just destroyed his ballots. And the myth was that they were dumped in the Hackensack River. So once the results were out and people started to suspect foul play, Hague said, hey, if you don't like the way we do the elections here in Hudson County, come and take a look. I dare you to come and do a recount. And it was right around this time, shortly after the election of A. Harry Moore, that Hague made his famous speech, which included the statement, I am the law. Now, it was taken out of context, but it doesn't matter. He was labeled, I am the law, from that point forward. And my contention is he was intoxicated with power. He could care less. He was, in fact, the law. So that speech was made only less than a week after the election. So he was definitely feeling full of oats. So who cried foul? In addition to Clee, although Clee was somewhat reticent, the Republican reformers in the clean government movement, led by a gentleman named Arthur Vanderbilt, they organized the whole effort to try and prove that the election was stolen. Robert H. McCarter was a former attorney general. He became legal counsel for Clee, and he orchestrated or helped orchestrate all the efforts to try and expose the fraud. Independent candidate James F. Murray, who was a lawyer, was hired and retained as associate counsel and was very active on the ground in Jersey City and Hudson County in pursuing the investigation of the fraud. So, Murray essentially summed it up. He said, because he almost beat Hague in 1929 in the municipal election. And he said, since that time, Hague ensured that he would never lose an election by systematically inflating the registry lists, and he has complete domination over the Republican Election Board, which we'll see in a moment. Those who didn't oppose the notion that the election was stolen was the incumbent governor, who was a Republican, although by this time he was a disgraced Republican. And the gentleman that I mentioned earlier, Nookie Johnson, who's the Atlantic City Republican boss, both of them had a vested interest in seeing Hague's preferred candidate win. So the leadership of the GOP, other than the guys who cried foul that we just saw, basically had no sympathy for Clee, and they pretended as if there was no attempt to investigate or expose voter fraud in Hudson County. In fact, Hoffman, in his farewell address to the legislature, urged them to just concede and move on. Now, before I leave Hoffman, it was later discovered that Hoffman had embezzled $300,000 plus dollars from his time in office, both as governor and other positions that he held, and that Hague was fully aware of that, and he used the threat of blackmail to keep Hoffman in his pocket. Okay, so how did Hague control the election apparatus of Hudson County? There was a very, very curiously structured and dysfunctional organization known as the Bureau of Elections, run by nominally Republican officials. Charles Stobling, the guy we mentioned before, who was the GOP county party leader for Hudson County, he was the commissioner of registration. John Ferguson was the superintendent of elections. And these two guys were at each other's throats the entire time, particularly once this election was put under the microscope. And Ferguson said, you can't conduct an election in Hudson County unless you have it policed with an armed militia. It's that bad, right? So he advised and encouraged Clee to pursue the recount. Next. Stobling, on the other hand, waffled after irregularities were found in the poll books that Clee's team was allowed to see, and then from that point forward, stonewalled. I don't really know. They don't even know how they got in there, but they did manage to look at 2 poll books that showed a host of irregularities, such as people dead voting, as you saw earlier, people that had moved away signing affidavits that they didn't vote, they weren't in Jersey City. There were people who were in the insane asylum and people who were on their deathbeds who couldn't have voted if they wanted to. And this was the only evidence that physical evidence that they were able to obtain, because they were denied access. This guy Stobling, who was the he was in charge of all the registration records, he mysteriously developed a fatal illness, so-called, right? And he was unavailable. And he said, if I can't be available, the election records are not to be exposed or revealed to anyone. And that was the gist of the whole dispute, was how do we get access to the information necessary to carry out a recount? So they did pursue a recount initially, but the Chief Justice overseeing the recount process, Thomas Brogan, refused to allow them to do anything but count ballots, not look at any of the supporting documentation in the polls and the registers, right? The poll books or the registers. So that led to them being so frustrated that they wanted to pursue a court investigation. So they made a plea to the Supreme Court to please investigate the fraud. And of course, the presiding judge was the same judge, Thomas Brogan. He denied it, threw it out. Now, because of that, it swiftly led to the Board of Canvassers certifying the election results. And who presided over that? The incumbent governor, who raised no objection, which led to A. Harry Moore being declared governor-elect and then sworn in swiftly on January 18th. That left Clee and his colleagues no choice but to pursue a legislative investigation, and hence the creation of the Young Committee, which was formed only by the state assembly. The Republican-dominated state Senate refused to go along, and that's where Nookie Johnson's influence came in, and Hague's stooges in the Senate all combined to basically thwart the whole idea of a joint investigation, which would have had more clout. But instead, the Assembly had to do it on its own, and as we'll see, that led to some problems in terms of its authority and its legality. Clee was completely despondent, saying, how can it be? They dared me to make the probe, and then they block it and prevent the probe from happening. And Thomas Brogan's ruling said there's no relationship whatsoever between the failure to compare signatures and the result of the election as declared. That takes an amazing amount of willingness to suspend disbelief, because in a paper ballot environment, it's all about signature matching. So A. Harry Moore was sworn in by Chief Justice Thomas Brogan. Both of these men owed their entire political careers to Frank Hague. And then immediately thereafter, Hague's personal lawyer and fixer and financial advisor, John Milton, was appointed to fill out the term of A. Harry Moore in the U.S. Senate. It was the state assembly then, under the Young Committee, trying to pursue the investigation. Now, I would encourage you, if you're interested in seeing multiple examples of obstruction, of deflection, of delay and denial, please go to the article, because I do detail that out quite vividly, much more than we have the time to discuss today. But suffice it to say that every stone they tried to overturn resulted in a pushback by the machine and machine operatives, such that it actually came to the potential for physical violence at the vault where the registration records were held, right? So the Young Committee tried to elicit the support of the state police, but they were denied that. As you'll see, the governor, they actually went to the governor that they were trying to repudiate his election and said, can you authorize the state police? Because the state police won't take any direction from us, basically saying you have no authority to tell us what to do. It became a huge constitutional dilemma, because in effect, the political machine of Hudson County disenfranchised the state assembly and completely disempowered the Young Committee. So what were they after? What did they want to find? They wanted these documents, these massive poll books and these voter registration records that all hinged on the integrity of matching the signatures. And all of that was, so the gentleman in the middle there, this is actually a Jersey City election picture. Not sure who he was, but he's one of the election officials that would decide whether or not there was a matching signature that would allow the person to vote. And they had floaters that would come in masquerading as dead voters or whomever. They already had the names on the register. They just took the names, voted, went to the next polling station, took the name, voted, etc. That's how it worked. That's how they manufactured the votes. So poll books and voter registries were the key auditing tools for paper ballot elections. And this is what the committee wanted, and they were refused access to be able to see. So much so that there were Hudson County police guarding the election office in Jersey City. So when the committee showed up, they had their own sergeant at arms. They had a safe cracker because this stuff was in a vault. And they literally intended to blow open or crack open the safe to get at the registration records necessary to prove that there was fraud, to get the evidence they needed to prove their case. And it was almost a riot, right? Fortunate that no one was injured, but it almost came to a complete violent brawl. So the election records were in the vault. Stoving refused to allow access to the vault and made himself completely unavailable. The police were assigned to protect the election records and to basically repel the Young Committee from ever getting to see them. And it was an armed confrontation that could have gotten very ugly. So real quickly, the gist of it is the Young Committee formed by the state assembly was delegitimized by the courts, right? The attorney general said the state police didn't have to follow their instructions. The governor refused to give them any assistance, of course. Machine orchestrated obstruction and control of the courts resulted in the vice chancellor saying, you guys don't even have the authority to investigate because the way in which your committee was formed was unconstitutional. You're usurping the role of the courts by pursuing this investigation. Therefore, nobody has any obligation to honor your subpoenas. And then months later, that ruling was upheld by the Court of Errors and Appeals. And who do you think sat on that court? Thomas Brogan and a whole bunch of other Hague appointed justices. So at the same time that this was unfolding, that's when Hague prosecuted his anti-Reds campaign, his Red Menace campaign, which ultimately led to a Supreme Court decision against Hague, but it's called Hague versus CIO. And this just showed that Hague had absolutely no restraint or constraint in wielding power at this point in time. Hence the phrase bossism on steroids. Now, his last hurrah, politically speaking, was a few years later at the 1940 Democratic Convention. And I really didn't appreciate this until I did this research. FDR sought an unprecedented third term, which was constitutionally permitted, but by convention no one had ever done, going back to Washington. The Democratic elders of the day were not comfortable with this. And therefore, Roosevelt wanted it, but sort of let it be known that he wouldn't make it public. He wanted it to be a draft. And it was the bosses, Ed Kelly and Frank Hague, who got behind that movement to draft Roosevelt to be nominated for a third term run. So he had to basically rely on the Democratic bosses. And if you know anything about FDR, he railed against Tammany Hall when he was governor of New York, right? But in the end, he had to rely on them to achieve his goal of getting elected a third time. So, of course, the Republicans vilified this by saying there was a third term trio of dictators, Hague, Kelly, and Flynn. Flynn was a Tammany Hall guy in the Bronx, all of whom got behind the effort to draft Roosevelt for a third term, which, of course, the Republicans cried foul. Their candidate, Wendell Winkie, went down to defeat, although the majority, FDR's majority, was not nearly as strong as it was 4 years before. Next. So let's do a wrap up real quickly. So the highlights of the research establish that there is, in fact, evidence to support the theory that institutionalized voter fraud is what turned the election in A. Harry Moore's favor. Control of the election apparatus, both particularly at the county level, but having influence and control over the state judiciary and law enforcement, made any attempt to try and investigate, let alone overturn the election, impossible, because the Republicans in Hudson County were complicit in the fraud. Padded registration rolls was kind of the formula for the way in which Hague turned these elections to his favor. Voting irregularities and the spoiler candidate, which we saw, further revealed the shenanigans that went down at the polls. Hague Republicans were either collaborators or captives. The Bureau of Elections in Hudson County was completely subordinate to the Hague machine. Nookie Johnson and Harold Hoffman, both senior Republicans, the governor and the leader in Atlantic County, were completely open to cooperating with Hague when necessary, and probably did so secretly in this case. And the Senate Republican cabal, who didn't support the investigative committee that their own party launched, right? And in fact, they refused to fund it. So the Assembly voted for $35,000 to be devoted to the committee, and the Senate Republicans never supported that. The ultimate example was years later, there was a US Senate investigation into this in 1940, and the very records that the Young Committee was seeking to uncover had been shown to have been burned at Jersey City Hall. So there was no evidence left for anybody to uncover as to what happened in this election. So clearly bossism on steroids that made the Young Committee completely ineffectual, impeded all efforts to expose the evidence, whitewashed the tainted election, and then created a distraction, if you would, with the anti-Reds crusade that was taking place in parallel. That put Hague on the national papers as a precursor to Joe McCarthy. The Hague machine acted like a political syndicate because it was statewide. It encompassed both parties, hijacked the electoral process. It was independently funded by the corruption at the waterfront, the rackets that fueled the machine, even more so than the graft at City Hall. Hague had this symbiotic relationship with FDR, which FDR never turned on Hague. He tried a few things to soften Hague's image by displacing him with Charles Edison later on in 1940, but he never turned on Hague, and he never let anybody go after Hague. New Deal patronage czar, Hague had complete control over all of the patronage that came to New Jersey from FDR. Okay, I know we are over time, but if you would like to stay, I'm happy to entertain any questions that you may have. So the details of what we discussed at a very high level are explicated in this article. If you have the time and interest to pursue it, I'd be flattered, and I think you'd find it very eye-opening and very relevant to our national conversation today about stolen elections and redistricting. So any questions from anyone while we have time?
Could an election be stolen now if someone like Hague was in power?
Depends. At the national level, at the state level, at the local level. I mean, Hague was able to do it at both city, county, and state level in New Jersey. And in fact, Hague turned New Jersey blue because it was a Republican state up until this time. And it remains blue to this day. So can an election be stolen? I think we're seeing some things happening with redistricting that are highly, highly questionable, ethically as well as constitutionally.
Would you consider the only reason he was able to steal this election was because of the paper ballot system rather than the machine ballot system?
There's a very strong case for that. Because once machine voting was introduced in Hudson County, Hague's ability to influence elections at the state level really waned. So he probably knew, he resisted any reforms, as you can imagine, and he was vehemently opposed to the New Jersey new Constitution of 1947 because it would basically disable all of the tools that he had built and put in place over the years through the courts, through the election process, etc. It would basically undo everything that he had built because the state now was controlling elections rather than them being controlled at the local level, and introducing technology to ensure that there was more integrity to the process.
What
Anybody
happened
else?
to Hague after all of this?
Okay. Hague was defeated. Well, first of all, he resigned the Jersey City mayoralty in 1947 after 30 years in office. He carried on as county leader for a while, but one of his lieutenants, a guy by the name of John V. Kenny, along with my grandfather, unseated the Hague ticket in the election and took over Jersey City Hall. So once Jersey City fell to the anti-Hague forces, it was only a matter of time before the county would follow suit. And then Hague was kind of shuffled off into retirement. And he spent the rest of his life in New York City, living in a very, very expensive Fifth Avenue apartment, and lived to be 82 years old. Never prosecuted, never imprisoned. Often prosecuted, but never convicted. Now, the machine that came after Hague was not that much better, probably more corrupt in many ways, but was not able to operate anywhere close to the level of political efficiency of what Hague presided over for 35 years.
How defining was Hague's political machine in what the common nomenclature is of Jersey politics? So how much
How, de-
influence did Hague have?
how defining, was that the question?
Yeah.
Well, sadly, Jersey City became, I should say, New Jersey became so identified with Hague that the rest of the state felt that Hudson County was a pariah because it soiled the reputation of the rest of the state, which was largely rural and mostly Republican, right? Up until 1940, up until 1932, I should say, when FDR finally won a national election, which he could not have won without Hudson County. So for years, New Jersey, and I think Jersey politics has been maligned as a result of Hague's reputation. However, there are redeeming qualities to what Hague did with the political power that he had in terms of investing in the development of Jersey City in particular, right? He built a lot of, like the Jersey City Medical Center, a lot of these things may have been more an outgrowth of his own ego and vanity, but they did serve his constituents well for as long as they were able to be financed. The medical center alone was an 11 building complex. It was the largest medical facility in the country at the time, but then it became financially unsustainable, after Hague fell from power and his opponents took over. These became financial liabilities because Hudson County and Jersey City were in decline. Industry was leaving, populations dwindling. 30 or 40,000 people left Jersey City alone from 1930 to 1960. So what Hague built up and contributed to his community couldn't be sustained after his political tenure passed. Anybody else?
I don't see any other questions. So I think we
Okay.
can go ahead and end
Did
it
we
there.
lose anybody along the way, or did we
Yeah, a
maintain
couple
interest?
people, but
Yeah.
Anything you want to close with, Joe?
Well, I want to thank you all for being here and investing your time and spending it with us to better understand this rather intriguing and fascinating aspect of our state's history. I do think there's contemporary relevance, as one of the questions suggests. Could an election be stolen today? I'm not in a position to answer that authoritatively, but I think there are some pretty ominous signs that possibility exists. So if you have further interest, please pursue reading the article, and I wish you all well, and I appreciate your interest and your attention.
All right. Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you everybody for attending today. You found it enjoyable and informative as I did, and it's very relevant to the times now. So it's wonderful to revisit this part of not only New Jersey history, but also the national implications that it had too. So
Very
if
good.
everybody be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you again. Thank you, Andrew.